My mother introduced me to her colleagues at my brother's promotion dinner. She forgot to mention what I do for a living. She said, "This is my daughter Cara. She works with children." Then she turned back to the conversation like I'd already left the room. I was 31 years old. I had been a licensed elementary school teacher for 6 years. I had 43 students across 2 combined classes, 4 of whom had IEPs I'd written myself, 1 of whom had learned to read for the first time at age 9 under my instruction specifically. My mother described all of that as works with children with the same tone she'd used to say she parks cars, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The Ellison family has been in medicine for 3 generations. My grandfather was a cardiac surgeon in Baltimore who worked until he was 74 and died with his name on a hospital wing. My father continued that in his own way. Not surgery, but health law. The kind that gets you on university boards and quoted in policy papers. My mother is a hospitalist with privileges at 2 systems and a reputation among residents for being the attending who doesn't waste words. My brother Derek just made partner at a medical malpractice firm at 34. The framed photographs in the hallway of my parents' house follow a clear sequence. My grandfather at a conference podium, my father shaking hands with a senator, Derek at his law school graduation with both parents' hands on his shoulders. I am not in those photographs, not because nothing happened worth photographing, because at 22, when I told my family I wanted to teach elementary school instead of following any version of the path they'd laid out, my father set down his coffee cup with the careful deliberateness of a man choosing not to say the first thing that occurred to him. My mother asked very quietly whether I'd considered what that would look like on paper. What it would look like on paper. 6 years later, I still think about that sentence. They didn't fight me on it. That would have been easier in some ways. Instead, they developed a vocabulary. My mother referred to my job as my calling in a tone that made it sound like something between a hobby and a medical diagnosis. My father asked at every family gathering for the first 2 years whether I was still doing the classroom thing. When I stopped correcting them, they took that as confirmation that I'd accepted their framing. I hadn't. I'd just gotten tired of the argument going nowhere. I teach 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary in a district that serves a mostly working-class community 40 minutes outside the city. The school has water-stained ceiling tiles in 2 of the hallways and a music program that parents fundraised to keep alive. My salary is $48,000 a year. I buy classroom supplies in August with my own money, keep a second set of winter gloves in my desk for kids who show up without any, and spend roughly 4 hours every Sunday planning lessons for the week ahead. I have had parents cry in my doorway because their child came home and said school was the best part of their day for the first time since kindergarten. My family has never visited my classroom. They were invited once. I had a student present a science project she'd been working on for 6 weeks. A girl named Lily who had been selectively mute for most of 2nd grade and who stood up in front of 28 kids and spoke for 4 uninterrupted minutes about monarch butterfly migration. I sent the invitation to the family group text 2 weeks in advance. My mother said she had rounds. My father said he had a faculty meeting. Derek didn't respond until 3 days later with a thumbs up emoji. I kept the photo Lily's mom sent me on my phone for a long time. Eventually I stopped looking at it because looking at it made me feel something I couldn't name cleanly, something between pride and grief. And that combination was exhausting to carry around. So when people ask why I never talked much about Marcus to my family, why I kept that part of my life in a separate room from all of this, the honest answer is there was nothing to discuss. They had already decided what my life was worth. Introducing someone I loved into that calculation felt like handing them another measuring stick. They knew I was seeing someone. My father's complete investigation, conducted over the phone one Sunday in October, lasted approximately 90 seconds. What does he do? He builds things. Builds what? Custom furniture mostly. Some architectural woodworking. Is that full-time? Yes. A pause long enough to be its own sentence. Well, I suppose people always need furniture. That was it. 14 months of my life. 90 seconds and a shrug. Marcus Tate builds furniture. That's true as far as it goes. The way saying my grandfather worked in medicine is technically true. He has a workshop on 3 acres outside of town with a converted barn, a wood-fired kiln for his own lumber drying, and a 2-year waiting list. His pieces appear in design publications I started reading only after we'd been together for 3 months, and I finally Googled his full name out of curiosity. Architectural Digest had called him, in a piece I found from 4 years ago, one of the most significant American furniture makers working today. He had turned down the interview twice before agreeing to a print-only feature with no photographs of his face. He drove a 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked side mirror and kept a folding handsaw on the passenger seat floor. When I met him at a neighborhood craft fair where my school had a booth, I had stopped to look at a small side table he'd made from reclaimed white oak and stayed for an hour. He asked me what I was working on at school that week. Not what grade do you teach, not how many kids. What was I working on? I told him about a unit I was building around local history, about how I was trying to make the Revolutionary War feel like something that happened to real people instead of a list of dates. He sat on the edge of his display table and listened like that was the most interesting problem he'd heard in months. He asked follow-up questions. Good ones. He was not entirely what he appeared to be. There were small things that didn't quite add up. A phone call he took outside, speaking in the measured cadence of someone running a board meeting. A manila envelope on his kitchen counter labeled with a law firm name I vaguely recognized, thick enough to be a contract. A line on his laptop screen once, glimpsed when I brought him coffee, Phase 3 land trust acquisition. Closing pending county approval. I asked about it once, lightly. He said it was old business, nothing interesting. I let it go, not because I wasn't curious, but because none of it changed the way he showed up. He was present, he was paying attention. That was rarer than any credential. My brother Derek's 30th anniversary party was not technically a big event. Derek had been at his firm for 10 years. The dinner was my parents' idea, held at Ardmore, a private dining venue in the city with a wine cellar and the kind of table settings that require a staff member to explain which fork is which. 40 guests, old family friends, colleagues from the firm, 2 former professors Derek still stayed in touch with, and the evening's most notable attendee, Richard Okafor, a senior partner at Derek's firm and one of the most well-connected litigators in the state, who was there as a professional courtesy and stayed the whole evening because, as I later learned, he genuinely liked Derek. Marcus and I arrived on time. He wore a charcoal button-down and dark trousers, clean and simple. I wore a forest green dress I'd chosen myself. My mother, for the record, had sent me a link to a pale pink option from a department store with the note something a little more polished for the occasion. I hadn't ordered it. My parents greeted us at the entrance. My mother's smile held steady, but her gaze moved over Marcus with the quick professional assessment of someone cataloging a patient's vitals. My father shook Marcus's hand with the brisk efficiency of a man completing a task. I found out about the seating 3 days before the dinner. My mother had called about logistics and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she put me and Marcus at the far end of the second table near the private bar. You two will be comfortable there, she said. It's a little quieter, away from the main conversation. She made it sound like a gift. I knew it wasn't. The main table was where Derek would sit, where my parents would sit, where Richard Okafor and the senior colleagues would sit. Away from the main conversation was a location decision and also a values statement. We were background. I told Marcus that night. He was quiet for a moment, planing a piece of walnut at his workbench while I talked. Do you want to skip it? He asked. I thought about it. No. I said. I need to go, not to fix anything. I just need to see it one more time with clear eyes, and then I'm done trying to make them understand. He set the plane down and looked at me. Then I'll be there. The second table was fine, in the way that things are fine when the intention behind them is not. Our table had no flowers, just a short candle in a glass vessel. The main table had low arrangements of white ranunculus. I noticed because I noticed everything that evening, the way you do when you've decided something is the last time. Richard Okafor was seated at the main table between Derek and my father. He was relaxed, warm, the kind of person who makes every conversation feel deliberate rather than performed. Over the first 40 minutes of dinner, he glanced across the room 3 times. The first 2 times his gaze tracked generally. The third time, it stopped. He leaned slightly forward. The recognition moved across his face in stages, confusion first, then focus, then something unmistakable, disbelief that had corrected itself into certainty. The dinner speech was my father's to give. He is good at this. He commands a room without appearing to try, and the room at Ardmore that evening gave itself to him immediately. He spoke about legacy, about what it meant to come from a family that took the profession seriously, about Derek's decade of work with the kind of specific proud attention that made clear he had been paying close attention for 34 years. He has never taken the easy path, my father said, and the room agreed audibly. Then, with the practiced timing of someone who had rehearsed this, his gaze moved to me. Our daughter Cara, he said in a tone that was warm the way weather is warm right before a storm, chose a different direction. Teaching. Elementary school. He let a small pause do the work that words would have done less elegantly. It takes a certain kind of patience, I'm sure. He looked directly at me then. Still loving the classroom, sweetheart? 40 people turned in my direction. I did not answer. I took a sip of water. I put the glass down. Marcus, beside me, set his fork down slowly and stood up. The room registered it the way a room registers an unexpected sound. Not loudly, but completely. Every head turned. Richard Okafor stood at the same moment from the main table and walked across the room toward us. 40 people watched the evening's most prominent guest cross the floor toward the second table with an expression that did not match the lightness my father had just established. Marcus, he said, stopping at our table. His voice was calm, but the room was calmer. I thought that was you. I didn't put it together until just now. He looked at me, then at my parents. My father was standing. Richard, my father said carefully. You know this man. Richard Okafor looked at my father with the considered patience of someone deciding how much of the truth to use. Do I know him? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Warren, this is Marcus Tate. He's the founder of the Tate Materials Foundation. You may have seen the coverage last year about the Rural School Renovation Initiative. 11 school buildings across 4 counties. He funded it entirely from a liquidity event most people in this room would recognize if I named it. He glanced at Marcus. He sold his first company at 28 for enough that he never had to work again. He chose to work anyway, differently. A pause. He also, for what it's worth, underwrites the arts residency program at Millbrook Elementary, has for 3 years. He looked at me. Which I imagine you know better than I do. My father's mouth opened. Nothing came. I turned to look at Marcus. He was watching me, not the room. He spoke without raising his voice. I didn't come tonight to correct anything, he said. I came because Cara asked me to, and because she is one of the most genuinely dedicated people I've ever known. She teaches 31 8-year-olds in a school that doesn't have enough of anything, and she does it every day without complaint and without recognition. And she has spent years in this family being introduced as someone who works with children like. That's a way of saying she does something small. He looked at my father steadily. I've known her for 14 months. You've never asked my last name. That's information about what you were measuring. He sat back down. The room was completely silent. I stood. My legs were steady, which surprised me. My voice was steadier. You've been saying it for 6 years, I said to my parents, not loudly. There was no need to perform it. Not usually in words, in how you introduce me, in what you ask about and what you don't. In the fact that you have never, once, come to see what I actually do. My mother looked at the table. I'm not angry right now. I was angry for a long time. Now I'm just finished trying to fit into the space you designed for me. I looked at Marcus. We're leaving? We walked out. The room watched. No one spoke. The call from Derek came 2 days later. His voice was stripped of its usual confidence. The courtroom composure he'd been developing since law school. He said Richard Okafor had pulled him aside before leaving that evening and asked, very quietly, whether the family dynamic he'd witnessed was representative or an aberration. Derek had not known how to answer. Richard had told him, still quietly, that he had been considering recommending Derek for a joint committee appointment that came with significant visibility in their field, and that he needed to know whether Derek's judgment in personal situations matched his judgment in professional ones. He had not made a decision yet, but he was thinking. "I didn't know," Derek said. "About the foundation. About the school funding. About any of it." "You didn't ask," I said. "Neither did Mom and Dad. That's not the same as not knowing. That's choosing not to look." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's fair," he said finally. It cost him something to say it. I could hear that. My mother called 4 days after that. She asked if she could come to Millbrook, to the school. "Just to see it," she said. I asked her what had changed. She was quiet for longer than I expected. "I've been thinking about what you said," she said at last. "About the space we designed. And I think I knew we were doing it, and I told myself it was about wanting more for you. But I don't think that's what it was entirely. I think it was about what it looked like to other people. And that's not the same thing as loving you well." That honesty cost her something real. I could hear the unfamiliarity of it in her voice. The way you can tell when someone is saying a true thing for the first time rather than a rehearsed one. I told her she could come. I told her what it would require first. Not an apology visit, not a gesture, but a real one. One conversation, just the two of us, where she listened to what the last 6 years had felt like for me. Without redirecting, without context, without the word but. She agreed without negotiating, which itself told me something. She came on a Tuesday. I was between classes. She stood in the doorway of my classroom for a moment before she came in, just stood there looking at it. The reading corner with the mismatched pillows. The student work pinned unevenly to the boards. The table in the back, where I kept supplies in, labeled shoeboxes. I watched her look at it the way you look at a place that turns out to be larger than you expected. We sat at 2 student chairs pulled into the middle of the room, and I talked for almost an hour. She listened. There were moments when I could see her wanting to respond and choosing not to, which was its own kind of effort and its own kind of gift. At the end, she said she was sorry. Not the version of sorry that means "I'm sorry this upset you." The other version. The one that means "I caused this and I know it. We are not fixed." I want to be clear about that because easy resolutions are a lie, and I've spent too much time in this family with things papered over to do it myself now. We have had 3 more conversations since then. Some of them have been honest and painful and have moved something. Some of them have been 2 people sitting in the same room, trying and not quite getting there, which is maybe its own form of progress. My father has not called. I am not waiting for him to. If he does, I'll answer. If he doesn't, I have stopped arranging my life around the space he leaves. Richard Okafor, as it turned out, did recommend Derek for the committee appointment. He told Derek, when he called to give him the news, that what he'd seen at that dinner had ultimately been an answer to his question, just not the one Derek might expect. He'd seen Derek listen to Cara's speech without interrupting. He'd seen him not defend his parents. And he'd seen him call his sister 2 days later, which Richard only knew because Derek had mentioned it in a follow-up conversation without realizing he was sharing something that mattered. "That," Richard said, "told me what I needed to know about your judgment under pressure." Derek told me that story himself. I don't know if he told it to our parents. The Tate Materials Foundation funded a new science lab at Millbrook last spring. There's a plaque near the door that none of my students know how to read yet, because it uses words like endowment and in perpetuity. I know. A few of the other teachers know. Marcus came to the installation quietly on a morning when the students weren't there and helped the contractor carry equipment in from the parking lot. The principal thanked him. He said he was glad to help and asked about the curriculum. He is still not someone who needs the surface to match the substance. That remains, in my experience, the rarest combination of qualities I have ever encountered in a person. I have thought a lot about those years of trying to make my work legible to people who had already concluded what it was worth. About the energy that took. about the specific exhaustion of achieving something real and translating it constantly into the language of people who measure in a currency you don't carry. I stopped doing that, not all at once. Gradually, the way you stop doing most things that were never working. Not with a decision so much as a quiet recognition that the effort was going in a direction that had no destination. What replaced it was not vindication. I want to be precise about that because vindication is a complicated thing to want. What replaced it was something closer to clarity. The feeling of finally seeing the room you've been standing in without the particular distortion that hope produces. The hope that this time they'll see it, this time they'll ask, this time the conversation will be different. The last morning I sat in my car after a difficult conversation with my mother and took a moment before going in. The feeling in my chest was not triumph. It was not relief in the clean, easy sense. It was something more like the sensation of setting down weight you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it wasn't part of you. A slight unreality to the lightness, the way your arm feels after a cast comes off. Present. Functional. Strange in its normality. Marcus was in the workshop when I got there. He looked up from a piece of cherry wood he'd been shaping, read whatever was on my face, and waited. I sat down on the stool across from his bench. "I think I'm actually okay," I said. Not as a reassurance. As a report on what I found when I checked. He nodded like that was the answer he'd been holding space for and went back to the wood. We were quiet for a long time in the particular way that quiet is possible with someone who has never needed you to fill it. My class did a unit on community helpers in March, standard third-grade curriculum. I had the students write about someone in their life who helps people in a way that doesn't always get noticed. One of my students, a boy named Theo, who spent most of September refusing to write anything longer than 4 words, filled 2 pages about his grandmother who watches neighborhood kids after school so their parents can work. He read it aloud to the class. When he finished, the room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when something real just happened in them. I don't record those moments. I don't post them. I don't send them to anyone. They happen in a classroom 40 minutes outside the city, with water-stained ceiling tiles and a music program parents kept alive through bake sales, and then they're part of the air of that place, which I think is exactly where they belong. There's something I've been sitting with since all of this settled. About how much of what we call success is really just visibility. About how the things that matter most, the child who reads, the patient who moves, the person who decides to keep going, tend to happen in rooms that the people doing the measuring never enter. And about how easy it is to mistake the absence of a credential for the absence of a credential for the absence of a contribution. The two things have almost nothing to do with each other. I knew that before. I know it differently now. So let me ask you something before you go. Is there someone in your life whose work you've summarized in a single word? Whose value you assessed from a distance without looking closely at what was actually happening in that room? Because the thing about quiet contributions is that they don't ask to be found. They just keep going whether you find them or not. The question is only whether you want to know what you've been standing next to all along.